Chapter 5. Records from the 19th century BCE attest to the existence of an Assyrian merchant colony at Kanesh in Cappadocia. Kul Tepe, Turkish, lit. Ash Hill, also known as Kanesh or Nesha, is an archaeological site in Kayseri Province, Turkey. The closest modern city to Kul Tepe is Kayseri, about 20 kilometers southwest. It consists of a tell, the actual Kul Tepe, and a lower town, where an Assyrian settlement was found. Its ancient names are recorded in Assyrian and Hittite sources. In Old Assyrian inscriptions from the 20th and the 19th century BCE, the city was mentioned as Kane, Kanesh. In later Hittite inscriptions, the city was mentioned as Nia, Nesha, Nessa, Nisa, or occasionally as Anaya, Anisha. In 2014, the archaeological site was inscribed in the tentative list of World Heritage Sites in Turkey. It is also the site of discovery of the earliest traces of the Hittite language, the earliest attestation of an Indo-European language, dated to the 20th century BCE. Kane or Nia, inhabited continuously from the Chalcolithic to Roman times, flourished as an important Hattian, Hittite, and Hurrian city, containing a large kurum, merchant colony, of the Old Assyrian Empire from c. the 21st to 18th centuries BC. This kurum appears to have served as the administrative and distribution center of the entire Assyrian colony network in Anatolia. A late, c. 1400 BCE, witness to an old tradition includes a king of Kane called Zipani among 17 local city kings who rose up against Naram-Sin of Akkad, ruled c. 2254 to 2218 BC. The king of Zalpuwa, Una, raided Kanes, after which the Zalpuans carried off the city's Iu idol. Pithana, the king of Kusara, conquered Nia in the night, by force, but did not do evil to anyone in it. Nia revolted against the rule of Pithana's son, Anita, but Anita quashed the revolt and made Nia his capital. Anita further invaded Zalpuwa, captured its king Hosea, and recovered the Iu idol for Nia. In the 17th century BC, Anita's descendants moved their capital to Hadassa, which Anita had cursed, thus founding the line of Hittite kings. The inhabitants thus referred to the Hittite language as Neolai, the language of Nia. Cappadocia, /Kip, also Cappadocia, ancient and modern Greek, Apod, Romanized, Cappadocia, from Old Persian, Romanized, Katpatoka, Armenian, Romanized, Kappadovkia, Gamirk, Turkish, Kappadokia, is a historical region in central Anatolia, largely in the Nevşehir, Kayseri, Aksaray, Kırşehir, Malatya, Sivas, and Nigd provinces in Turkey. Since the late 300s BC the name Cappadocia came to be restricted to the inland province, sometimes called Great Cappadocia, Upper Cappadocia, which alone will be the focus of this article. Lower Cappadocia is focused elsewhere. According to Herodotus, in the time of the Ionian Revolt, 499 BC, the Cappadocians were reported as occupying a region from Mount Taurus to the vicinity of the Euxine, Black Sea. Cappadocia, in this sense, was bounded in the south by the chain of the Taurus Mountains that separate it from Cilicia, to the east by the upper Euphrates, to the north by Pontus, and to the west by Lycaonia and eastern Galatia. The name, traditionally used in Christian sources throughout history, continues in use as an international tourism concept to define a region of exceptional natural wonders, in particular characterized by fairy chimneys and a unique historical and cultural heritage. Cappadocia was known as Hatti in the Late Bronze Age, and was the homeland of the Hittite power centered at Hadassa. After the fall of the Hittite Empire, with the decline of the Syro-Cappadocians, Mushki, after their defeat by the Lydian king Croesus in the 6th century BC, Cappadocia was ruled by a sort of feudal aristocracy, dwelling in strong castles and keeping the peasants in a servile condition, which later made them apt to foreign slavery. It was included in the Third Persian satrapy in the division established by Darius but continued to be governed by rulers of its own, none apparently supreme over the whole country and all more or less tributaries of the great king. After ending the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great tried to rule the area through one of his military commanders. But Ariarathes, previously a satrap of the region, declared himself king of the Cappadocians. As Ariarathes I, 332–322 BC, he was a successful ruler, and he extended the borders of the Cappadocian kingdom as far as to the Black Sea. The kingdom of Cappadocia lived in peace until the death of Alexander. The previous empire was then divided into many parts, and Cappadocia fell to Eumenes. His claims were made good in 322 BC by the regent Perdiccas, who crucified Ariarathes, but in the dissensions which brought about Eumenes's death, Ariarathes II, the adopted son of Ariarathes I, recovered his inheritance and left it to a line of successors, who mostly bore the name of the founder of the dynasty. Persian colonists in the Cappadocian kingdom, cut off from their co-religionists in Iran proper, continued to practice Zoroastrianism. Strabo, observing them in the 1st century BC, records that these fire-kindlers possessed many holy places of the Persian gods, as well as fire temples. Strabo furthermore relates, were noteworthy enclosures, and in their midst there is an altar, on which there is a large quantity of ashes and where the Magi keep the fire ever burning. According to Strabo, who wrote during the time of Augustus, r. 63 BC 14 AD, almost 300 years after the fall of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, there remained only traces of Persians in Western Asia Minor. However, he considered Cappadocia almost a living part of Persia. Under Ariarathes IV, Cappadocia came into relations with Rome, first as a foe espousing the cause of Antiochus the Great, then as an ally against Perseus of Macedon. The kings henceforward threw in their lot with the Republic as against the Seleucids, to whom they had been from time to time tributary. Ariarathes V marched with the Roman proconsul Publius Licinius Crassus Dives Mucianus against Aristonicus, a claimant to the throne of Pergamon, and their forces were annihilated, 130 BC. The imbroglio which followed his death ultimately led to interference by the rising power of Pontus and the intrigues and wars which ended in the failure of the dynasty. The Cappadocians, supported by Rome against Mithridates VI of Pontus, elected a native lord, Ariobarzanes, to succeed, 93 BC, but in the same year Armenian troops under Tigranes the Great entered Cappadocia, dethroned King Ariobarzanes and crowned Gordios as the new client king of Cappadocia, thus creating a buffer zone against the encroaching Romans. It was not until Rome had deposed the Pontic and Armenian kings that the rule of Ariobarzanes was established, 63 BC. In the civil wars Cappadocia was first for Pompey, then for Caesar, then for Antony, and finally, Octavian. The Ariobarzanes dynasty came to an end. A Cappadocian nobleman Archelaus was given the throne, by favor first of Antony and then of Octavian, and maintained tributary independence until AD 17, when the Emperor Tiberius, whom he had angered, summoned him to Rome and reduced Cappadocia to a Roman province. In 70 AD, Vespasian joined Armenia Minor to Cappadocia, and made the combined province a frontier bulwark. It remained, under various provincial redistributions, part of the Eastern Empire for centuries. Cappadocia contains several underground cities. See Kamakli underground city. The underground cities have vast defense networks of traps throughout their many levels. These traps are very creative, including such devices as large round stones to block doors and holes in the ceiling through which the defenders may drop spears. In 314, Cappadocia was the largest province of the Roman Empire, and was part of the Diocese of Pontus. The region suffered famine in 368, described as the most severe ever remembered by Gregory of Nazianzus. The city was in distress and there was no source of assistance. The hardest part of all such distress is the insensibility and insatiability of those who possess supplies, such are the buyers and sellers of corn. By his word and advice Basil opened the stores of those who possessed them, and so, according to the scripture, dealt food to the hungry and satisfied the poor with bread. He gathered together the victims of the famine, and obtaining contributions of all sorts of food which can relieve famine, set before them basins of soup and such meat as was found preserved among us, on which the poor live. Such was our young furnisher of corn, and second Joseph. But unlike Joseph, Basil's services were gratuitous and his succor of the famine gained no profit, having only one object, to win kindly feelings by kindly treatment, and to gain by his rations of corn the heavenly blessings. This is similar to another account by Gregory of Nyssa that Basil ungrudgingly spent upon the poor his patrimony even before he was a priest, and most of all in the time of the famine, during which Basil was a ruler of the church, though still a priest in the rank of presbyters, and afterwards did not hoard even what remained to him. In 371, the western part of the Cappadocia province was divided into Cappadocia Prima, with its capital at Caesarea, modern-day Kayseri, and Cappadocia Secunda, with its capital at Tyana. By 386, the region to the east of Caesarea had become part of Armenia Secunda, while the northeast had become part of Armenia Prima. Cappadocia largely consisted of major estates, owned by the Roman emperors or wealthy local families. The Cappadocian provinces became more important in the latter part of the 4th century, as the Romans were involved with the Sasanian Empire over control of Mesopotamia and Armenia beyond the Euphrates. Cappadocia, now well into the Roman era, still retained a significant Iranian character. Stephen Mitchell notes in the Oxford Dictionary of Late Antiquity, many inhabitants of Cappadocia were of Persian descent and Iranian fire worship is attested as late as 465. The Cappadocian fathers of the 4th century were integral to much of early Christian philosophy. It also produced, among other people, another patriarch of Constantinople, John of Cappadocia, who held office 517–520. For most of the Byzantine era it remained relatively undisturbed by the conflicts in the area with the Sassanid Empire, but was a vital frontier zone later against the Muslim conquests. From the 7th century, Cappadocia was divided between the Anatolic and Armeniac themes. In the 9th–11th centuries, the region comprised the themes of Charcianon and Cappadocia. Cappadocia shared an always changing relationship with neighboring Armenia, by that time a region of the empire. The Arab historian Abu al-Faraj asserts the following about Armenian settlers in Shivas: during the 10th century, Shivas, in Cappadocia, was dominated by the Armenians and their numbers became so many that they became vital members of the imperial armies. These Armenians were used as watchposts in strong fortresses, taken from the Arabs. They distinguished themselves as experienced infantry soldiers in the imperial army and were constantly fighting with outstanding courage and success by the side of the Romans, in other words Byzantine. As a result of the Byzantine military campaigns and the Seljuk invasion of Armenia, the Armenians spread into Cappadocia and eastward from Cilicia into the mountainous areas of northern Syria and Mesopotamia, and the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia was eventually formed. This immigration was increased further after the decline of the local imperial power and the establishment of the Crusader states following the Fourth Crusade. To the Crusaders, Cappadocia was Terra Hermeniarum, the land of the Armenians, due to the large number of Armenians settled there. Following the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, various Turkish clans under the leadership of the Seljuks began settling in Anatolia. With the rise of Turkish power in Anatolia, Cappadocia slowly became a tributary to the Turkish states that were established to the east and to the west. Some of the native population converted to Islam, with the rest forming the remaining Cappadocian Greek population. By the end of the early 12th century, Anatolian Seljuks had established their sole dominance over the region. With the decline and the fall of the Konya-based Seljuks in the second half of the 13th century, they were gradually replaced by successive Turkic-ruled states, the Karaman-based Beylik of Karaman and then the Ottoman Empire. Cappadocia remained part of the Ottoman Empire until 1922, when it became part of the modern state of Turkey. A fundamental change occurred in between when a new urban center, Nevşehir, was founded in the early 18th century by a Grand Vizier who was a native of the locality, Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha, to serve as regional capital, a role the city continues to assume to this day. In the meantime, many former Cappadocians had shifted to a Turkish dialect, written in Greek alphabet, Karamanlika, and where the Greek language was maintained, Seal, villages near Kayseri, Farisa town, and other nearby villages, it became heavily influenced by the surrounding Turkish. This dialect of Eastern Roman Greek is known as Cappadocian Greek. Following the foundation of Turkey in 1922, those who still identified with this pre-Islamic culture of Cappadocia were required to leave, so this language is now only spoken by a handful of their descendants, most now located in modern Greece. Assyria, Akkadian, Classical Syriac, or, also at times called the Assyrian Empire, was a Mesopotamian kingdom and empire of the ancient Near East that existed as a state from perhaps as early as the 25th century BC, in the form of the Assur city-state, until its collapse between 612 BC and 605 BC, thereby spanning the periods of the early to Middle Bronze Age through to the Late Iron Age. This vast span of time is divided into the early period, 2500–2025 BC, Old Assyrian Empire, 2025–1378 BC, Middle Assyrian Empire, 1392–934 BC, and Neo-Assyrian Empire, 911–605 BC. From the end of the 7th century BC, when the Assyrian state fell, to the mid-7th century AD, it survived as a geopolitical entity, for the most part ruled by foreign powers such as the Achaemenid Empire, Seleucid Empire, and Parthian-Sasanian empires. Between the mid-2nd century BC and late 3rd century AD an Assyrian revival occurred, during which a number of independent Assyrian states such as Adiabene, Osren, Beth-Nuhadra, Beth-Garme, and perhaps Assur itself, arose. The final part of this period saw Mesopotamia become a major center of Syriac Christianity and the birthplace of the Assyrian Church of the East, including its offshoot, the Chaldean Catholic Church, and Syriac Orthodox Church. Greeks, Romans, and subsequently Arabs and Ottomans also took over control of the Assyrian lands. A Semitic-speaking realm, Assyria was centered on the Tigris in Upper Mesopotamia, in modern terms, northern Iraq, northeast Syria, and southeast Turkey, with fringe areas of northwest Iran. The Assyrians came to rule powerful empires in several periods. Making up a substantial part of the greater Mesopotamian cradle of civilization, which included Sumer, the Akkadian Empire, and Babylonia, Assyria reached the height of technological, scientific, and cultural achievements for its time. Starting around 911 BC, the Assyrians began campaigning to expand their Third Empire. They conquered, extracted tribute, and built new fortified towns, palaces, and temples. By constant warfare the Assyrians created an empire that stretched from eastern Libya, Egypt, and Cyprus in the East Mediterranean to Iran, and from present-day Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Transcaucasia to the Arabian Peninsula and southern Egypt in the south. The name Assyria originates with the Assyrian state's original capital, the ancient city of Ur, which dates to c. 2600 BC, originally one of a number of Akkadian-speaking city-states in Mesopotamia. In the 25th and 24th centuries BC, Assyrian kings were pastoral leaders. From the late 24th century BC, the Assyrians became subject to Sargon of Akkad, who united all the Akkadian and Sumerian-speaking peoples of Mesopotamia under the Akkadian Empire, which lasted from c. 2334 to 2154 BC. After the Assyrian Empire fell, the greater remaining part of Assyria formed a geopolitical region and province of other empires, although between the mid-2nd century BC and late 3rd century AD a patchwork of small independent Assyrian kingdoms arose, including Assur, Adiabene, Osren, Beth-Nuhadra, Beth-Garme, and Hatra emerged. The region of Assyria fell under the successive control of the Median Empire of 605 to 549 BC, the Achaemenid Empire of 550 to 330 BC, the Macedonian Empire, late 4th century BC, the Seleucid Empire of 312 to 63 BC, the Parthian Empire of 247 BC to 224 AD, the Roman Empire, from 116 to 118 AD, and the Sasanian Empire of 224 to 651 AD. The Arab Islamic conquest of the area in the mid-7th century finally dissolved Assyria, Ashuristan, a region which by then also included the former Babylonia, as a single entity, after which the remnants of the Assyrian people, by now almost all Christians, gradually became an ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and religious minority in the Assyrian homeland, surviving there to this day as an indigenous people of the region. In prehistoric times, the region that was to become known as Assyria, and Subartu, was home to a Neanderthal culture such as has been found at the Shanida cave. The earliest Neolithic sites in what will be Assyria were the Jarmo culture c. 7100 BC, the Halaf culture c. 6100 BC, and the Hassuna culture c. 6000 BC. The Akkadian-speaking people, the earliest historically attested Semitic-speaking people, who would eventually found Assyria, appear to have entered Mesopotamia at some point during the latter 4th millennium BC, c. 3500–3000 BC, eventually intermingling with the earlier Sumerian-speaking population, who came from northern Mesopotamia, with Akkadian names appearing in written record from as early as the 29th century BC. During the 3rd millennium BC, a very intimate cultural symbiosis developed between the Sumerians and the Akkadians throughout Mesopotamia, which included widespread bilingualism. The influence of Sumerian, a language isolate, on Akkadian, and vice versa, is evident in all areas, from lexical borrowing on a massive scale, to syntactic, morphological, and phonological convergence. This has prompted scholars to refer to Sumerian and Akkadian in the 3rd millennium BC as a Sprachbund. Akkadian gradually replaced Sumerian as the spoken language of Mesopotamia somewhere after the turn of the 3rd and the 2nd millennium BC, the exact dating being a matter of debate, although Sumerian continued to be used as a sacred, ceremonial, literary, and scientific language in Mesopotamia until the 1st century AD, as did use of the Akkadian cuneiform. The cities of Assur, Nineveh, Gazur, and Arbela, together with a number of other towns and cities, existed since at least before the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, c. 2600 BC, although they appear to have been Sumerian-ruled administrative centers at this time, rather than independent states. Greco-Roman classical writers such as Julius Africanus, Marcus Vilius Paterculus and Diodorus Siculus dated the founding of Assyria to various dates between 2284 BC and 2057 BC, listing the earliest king as Belus or Ninus. According to the biblical generations of Noah, in Genesis chapter 10, the city of Ur was allegedly founded by Ashur the son of Shem, who was deified by later generations as the city's patron god. However, the much older attested Assyrian tradition itself lists the first king of Assyria as the 25th century BC Tudiyah, and an early Urbanist Assyrian king named Ushpiya, c. 2050 BC, as having dedicated the first temple to the god Ashur in the city in the mid-21st century BC. It is highly likely that the city was named in honor of its patron Assyrian god with the same name. The city of Ur, together with a number of other Assyrian cities, seem to have been established by 2600 BC. However, it is likely that they were initially Sumerian-dominated administrative centers. In the late 26th century BC, Eannatum of Lagash, then the dominant Sumerian ruler in Mesopotamia, mentions smiting Subartu, Subartu being the Sumerian name for Assyria. Similarly, in the early 25th century BC, Lugalan Mundu, the king of the Sumerian state of Adab, lists Subartu as paying tribute to him. Of the early history of the kingdom of Assyria, little is known. In the Assyrian king list, the earliest king recorded was Tudiyah. According to George Isru, he would have lived in the mid-25th century BC, i.e. c. 2450 BC. In archaeological reports from Ebla, it appeared that Tudiyah's activities were confirmed with the discovery of a tablet where he concluded a treaty for the operation of a Kurum, trading colony, in Eblate territory, with King Ibrium of Ebla, who is now known to have been the vizier of Ebla for King Ishur-Damu. Tudiyah was succeeded on the list by Adamu, the first known reference to the Semitic name Adam, and then a further 13 rulers, Yanji, Sulamu, Harharu, Mandaru, Imsu, Harsu, Didanu, Hanu, Zeuabu, Nuabu, Abezu, Belus, and Azara. Nothing concrete is yet known about these names, although it has been noted that a much later Babylonian tablet listing the ancestral lineage of Hammurabi, the Amorite king of Babylon, seems to have copied the same names from Tudiyah through Nuabu, though in a heavily corrupted form. The earliest kings, such as Tudiyah, who are recorded as kings who lived in tents, were independent semi-nomadic pastoralist rulers. These kings at some point became fully urbanized and founded the city-state of Ur in the mid-21st century BC. During the Akkadian Empire, 2334–2154 BC, the Assyrians, like all the Akkadian-speaking Mesopotamians, and also the Sumerians, became subject to the dynasty of the city-state of Akkad, centered in central Mesopotamia. The Akkadian Empire founded by Sargon the Great claimed to encompass the surrounding four quarters. The region of Assyria, north of the seat of the empire in central Mesopotamia, had also been known as Subartug by the Sumerians, and the name Azuanum in Akkadian records also seems to refer to Assyria proper. The Sumerians were eventually absorbed into the Akkadian, Assyro-Babylonian, population. Assyrian rulers were subject to Sargon and his successors, and the city of Ashur became a regional administrative center of the empire, implicated by the Nuzi tablets. During this period, the Akkadian-speaking Semites of Mesopotamia came to rule an empire encompassing not only Mesopotamia itself but large swathes of Asia Minor, ancient Iran, Elam, the Arabian Peninsula, Canaan, and Syria. Assyria seems to have already been firmly involved in trade in Asia Minor by this time. The earliest known reference to Anatolian Karu in Hatti was found on later cuneiform tablets describing the early period of the Akkadian Empire, c. 2350 BC. On those tablets, Assyrian traders in Buru Shanda implored the help of their ruler, Sargon the Great, and this appellation continued to exist throughout the Assyrian Empire for about 1,700 years. The name Hatti itself even appears in later accounts of his grandson, Naram-Sin, campaigning in Anatolia. Assyrian and Akkadian traders spread the use of writing in the form of the Mesopotamian cuneiform script to Asia Minor and the Levant, modern Syria and Lebanon. However, towards the end of the reign of Sargon the Great, the Assyrian faction rebelled against him. The tribes of Assyria of the upper country in their turn attacked, but they submitted to his arms, and Sargon settled their habitations, and he smote them grievously. The Akkadian Empire was destroyed by economic decline and internal civil war, followed by attacks from barbarian Gutian people in 2154 BC. The rulers of Assyria during the period between c. 2154 BC and 2112 BC once again became fully independent, as the Gutians are only known to have administered southern Mesopotamia. However, the king list is the only information from Assyria for this period. Most of Assyria briefly became part of the Neo-Sumerian Empire, or Third Dynasty of Ur, founded in c. 2112 BC. Sumerian domination extended as far as the city of Ashur but appears not to have reached Nineveh and the far north of Assyria. One local ruler, Shakanaku, named Zarikam, who does not appear on any Assyrian king list, is listed as paying tribute to Amarsin of Ur. Ashur's rulers appear to have remained largely under Sumerian domination until the mid-21st century BC, c. 2050 BC. The king list names Assyrian rulers for this period and several are known from other references to have also borne the title of Shakanaka or vassal governors for the Neo-Sumerians. The Old Assyrian Empire is one of four periods into which the history of Assyria is divided, the other three being, the Early Assyrian period, the Middle Assyrian period and the New Assyrian period. Ushpiya, 2080 BC, appears to have been the first fully urbanized independent king of Assyria, and is traditionally held to have dedicated temples to the god Ashur in the city of the same name. He was followed by Sulili, Kikia, and Akiya, of whom little is known aside from Kikia conducting various building works in Assur. A number of scholars also place Zarikam, a contemporary of Amarsin, 2046–2038 BC, of Ur as an Assyrian ruler, though he does not appear on the Assyrian king list, but is claimed by Amarsin to be the governor of Assur. In approximately 2025 BC, a king named Puzarashur I came to the throne of Assyria, and there is some debate among scholars as to whether he was the founder of a new dynasty or a descendant of Ushpiya. He is mentioned as having conducted building projects in Assur, and he and his successors took the title Iiak or, meaning Viceroy of Ashur. From this time Assyria began to expand trading colonies called Kurum into Hurrian and Hattian lands in Anatolia. He was succeeded by Shalimuhum, c. 2000 BC, a king who is attested in a contemporary record of the time, leaving inscriptions in an archaic form of Akkadian. In addition to the expansions into Anatolia, Ilishuma, c. 1995–1974 BC, Middle Chronology, appears to have conducted military campaigns in southern Mesopotamia, either in conquest of the city-states of the south, or in order to protect his fellow Akkadian speakers from incursions by Elamites from the east and/or Amorites from the west. The freedom and be one of the Akkadians and their children I established. I purified their copper. I established their freedom from the border of the marshes and Ur and Nippur, Awal and Kismer, der of the god Ishtaran, as far as Assur. 7-8. He is known to have built the old temple of Ishtar in Assur. He was succeeded by another powerful king, the long-reigning Irishimai, 1973–1934 BC, who is notable for one of the earliest examples of written legal codes and introducing the limu, eponym, lists that were to continue throughout Assyrian history. He is known to have greatly expanded Assyrian trading colonies in Anatolia, with 21 being listed during his reign. These kurum traded in tin, textiles, lapis lazuli, iron, antimony, copper, bronze, wool, and grain, in exchange for gold and silver. Irishim also kept numerous written records, and conducted major building works in Assyria, including the building of temples to Ashur, Ishtar, and Adad. These policies were continued by Akunum, 1933–1921 BC, Sargon I, 1920–1881 BC, likely named after his predecessor Sargon of Akkad. During Sargon I's later reign, Babylon was founded as a small city-state, and Puzarashur II, 1880–1873 BC. Naram-Sin, 1872–1828 BC, repelled an attempted usurpation of his throne by the future king Shamshi-Adad I late in his reign. However, his successor Irisham II was deposed by Shamshi-Adad I in 1809 BC, bringing an end to the dynasty founded either by Ushpiya or Puzarashur I. Shamshi-Adad I, 1808–1776 BC, was already the ruler of Turksa, and although he claimed Assyrian ancestry as a descendant of Ushpiya, he is regarded as a foreign Amorite usurper by later Assyrian tradition. However, he greatly expanded the old Assyrian Empire, incorporating the northern half of Mesopotamia, swathes of eastern and southern Anatolia and much of the Levant into his large empire, and campaigned as far west as the eastern shores of the Mediterranean. His son and successor Ishmdagan I, 1775–1763 BC, gradually lost territory in southern Mesopotamia and the Levant to the state of Mari and Eshnunna respectively, and had mixed relations with Hammurabi, the king who had turned the hitherto young and insignificant city-state of Babylon into a major power and empire. After Shamshi-Adad I's death, Assyria was reduced to vassalage by Hammurabi, Mutashkar, 1763–1753 BC, Remush and Asanum were subservient to Hammurabi, who also took ownership of Assyrian trading colonies, thus bringing an end to the old Assyrian Empire. However, the Babylonian Empire proved to be short-lived, rapidly collapsing after the death of Hammurabi c. 1750 BC. An Assyrian governor named Puzarsin deposed Asanum, who was regarded as a foreign Amorite and a puppet of the new and ineffectual Babylonian king Sumuabum, and the Babylonian and Amorite presence was expunged from Assyria by Puzarsin and his successor Ashur-Dugal, who reigned for 6 years. A king called Adesai, 1720–1701 BC, finally restored strength and stability to Assyria, ending the civil unrest that had followed the ejection of the Babylonians and Amorites, founding the new Adeside dynasty. Belbani, 1700–1691 BC, succeeded Adesai and further strengthened Assyria against potential threats, and remained a revered figure even in the time of Ashur-bani-pal over 1,000 years later. There followed a long, prosperous, and peaceful period in Assyrian history. Rulers such as Libiya, 1691–1674 BC, Sharma-Adad I, Ibtarsin, Bazaya, Lulaya, Shunainua and Sharma-Adad II appear to have had peaceful and largely uneventful reigns. Assyria remained strong and secure, when Babylon was sacked and its Amorite rulers deposed by the Hittite Empire and subsequently fell to the Kassites in 1595 BC, both powers were unable to make any inroads into Assyria, and there seems to have been no trouble between the first Kassite ruler of Babylon, Agum II, and Irisham III, 1598–1586 BC, of Assyria, and a mutually beneficial treaty was signed between the two rulers. Shamshi-Adad II, 1585–1580 BC, Ishme-Dagon II, 1579–1562 BC, and Shamshi-Adad III, 1562–1548 BC, seem also to have had peaceful tenures, although few records have thus far been discovered about their reigns. Similarly, Ashur-Nirari I, 1547–1522 BC, seems not to have been troubled by the newly founded Mitanni Empire in Asia Minor, the Hittite Empire, or Babylon during his 25-year reign. He and his successor Puzarashur III, 1521–1497 BC, are known to have been active kings, improving the infrastructure, dedicating temples, and conducting various building projects throughout the kingdom. In Lil-Nasir I, Nuri-Li, Ashur-Shatuni and Ashur-Rubi I, who deposed his predecessor, followed. The emergence of the Hurri-Mitanni Empire and allied Hittite Empire in the 16th century BC did eventually lead to a short period of sporadic Mitannian-Hurrian domination in the latter half of the 15th century BC. The Mitannians, an Indo-Aryan-speaking people, are thought to have entered Anatolia from the north, conquered and formed the ruling class over the indigenous Hurrians of eastern Anatolia. The indigenous Hurrians spoke the Hurrian language, a language in the now wholly extinct Hurro-Urartian language family. Ashur-Nadin-Erhi, 1450–1431 BC, was courted by the Egyptians, who were rivals of Mitanni, and attempting to gain a foothold in the Near East. Amenhotep II sent the Assyrian king a gift of gold to seal an alliance against the Hurri-Mitannian Empire. It is likely that this alliance prompted Sashtutar, the emperor of Mitanni, to invade Assyria, and sack the city of Ashur, after which Assyria became a sometime vassal state. Ashur-Nadin-Erhi was deposed, either by Shaushtatar or by his own brother Enlil-Nasir II, 1430–1425 BC, in 1430 BC, who then paid tribute to the Mitanni. Ashur-Nirari II, 1424–1418 BC, had an uneventful reign and appears to have also paid tribute to the Mitanni Empire. The Assyrian monarchy survived, and the Mitannian influence appears to have been short-lived. They appear not to have been always willing or indeed able to interfere in Assyrian internal and international affairs. Ashur-bel-Nisheshu, 1417–1409 BC, seems to have been independent of Mitannian influence, as evidenced by his signing a mutually beneficial treaty with Karandash, the Kassite king of Babylonia in the late 15th century. He also undertook extensive rebuilding work in Ashur itself, and Assyria appears to have redeveloped its former highly sophisticated financial and economic systems during his reign. Ashur-rim-Nisheshu, 1408–1401 BC, also undertook building work, strengthening the city walls of the capital. Ashur-Nadin-Erhi II, 1400–1393 BC, also received a gift of gold and diplomatic overtures from Egypt, probably in an attempt to gain Assyrian military support against Egypt's Mitannian and Hittite rivals in the region. However, the Assyrian king appears not to have been in a strong enough position to challenge Mitanni or the Hittites. Ariba-Adad I, 1392–1366 BC, a son of Ashur-bel-Nisheshu, ascended the throne in 1392 BC and finally broke the ties to the Mitanni Empire, and instead turned the tables, and began to exert Assyrian influence on the Mitanni. The Middle Period, 1365–1056 BC, saw reigns of great kings, such as Ashur-uballit I, Arik-Denili, Tukulti-Ninurta I and Tiglath-Pileser I. During this period, Assyria overthrew the empire of the Hurri-Mitanni and annexed much of the Hittite Empire, and eclipsed the Egyptian Empire, Babylonia, Elam, Canaan, and Phrygia in the Near East. By the reign of Ariba-Adad I, 1392–1366 BC, Mitanni influence over Assyria was on the wane. Aribadad I became involved in a dynastic battle between Tushratta and his brother Artatama II and then Artatama's son Shutarna III, who called himself king of the Hurry while seeking support from the Assyrians, thus turning the tables on the Mitanni Hurrians. Ashur-uballit I, 1365–1330 BC, went further, defeating Shutarna III and bringing an end to the Mitanni Empire. The Assyrian king then annexed its territories in Anatolia and the Levant, turning Assyria once more into a major empire. The ambitious Assyrian king went further still, attacking and conquering Babylonia, and imposing a puppet ruler loyal to himself upon its throne. Assyria then annexed hitherto Babylonian territory in central Mesopotamia. Enlil-nirari, 1330–1319 BC, also defeated Babylonia's Kassite kings. The Hittites, having failed to save Mitanni, allied with Babylon in an unsuccessful economic war against Assyria for many years. Assyria was now a large and powerful empire, and a major threat to Egyptian and Hittite interests in the region, and was perhaps the reason that these two powers, fearful of Assyrian ambitions, made peace with one another. Arik-Denili, 1318–1307 BC, campaigned further still, entering northern ancient Iran and subjugating the pre-Iranic Kushans, Turukku and Nijami, before campaigning deeper into the Levant, subjugating the Sudians, Alamu and Yoru. His successor Adad-nirari I, 1307–1275 BC, was another highly successful military leader. He conquered Hanagalbat and the rest of the independent Hurro-Mitanni kingdoms of Anatolia, despite Hittite support for their allies. He also inflicted a crushing defeat on Babylonia at the Battle of Kar-Itar, annexing large swathes of Babylonian territory. Hittite kings during his reign assumed a placatory attitude towards the Assyrian king. Shalmaneser I, 1274–1245 BC, conquered 8 kingdoms in central Anatolia in his first year. In the next he defeated a coalition of Hittites, Hurrians, Mitanni and Alamu, annexing yet more territory in Anatolia and the Levant, and retaining Assyrian dominion over Babylonia and the northwest of ancient Iran. Shalmaneser also conducted extensive building work in major Assyrian cities such as Assur, Nineveh and Arbela, modern Erbil, and founded the city of Kalhu, the biblical Kala/Nimrud. Shalmaneser's son and successor, Tukulti-Ninurta I, 1244–1207 BC, won a major victory against the Hittites and their king Tudhaliya IV at the Battle of Neriya and took thousands of prisoners. Rather than being content simply to subjugate Babylonian kings as his predecessors had, he conquered Babylonia directly. He took Kashtiliash IV as a captive, and ruled Babylonia himself as king for 7 years, taking on the old title King of Sumer and Akkad first used by Sargon of Akkad. Tukulti-Ninurta I thus became the first Akkadian-speaking native Mesopotamian to rule the state of Babylonia, its founders having been foreign Amorites, succeeded by equally foreign Kassites. Tukulti-Ninurta petitioned the god Shamash before beginning his counter-offensive. Kashtiliash IV was captured, single-handed by Tukulti-Ninurta according to his account. He trod with my feet upon his lordly neck as though it were a footstool and deported him ignominiously in chains to Assyria. The victorious Assyrians demolished the walls of Babylon, massacred many of its defenders, pillaged and plundered his way across the city to the E-Sagila temple, and made off with the statue of Marduk. Middle Assyrian texts recovered at ancient Dur-Katlimmu include a letter from Tukulti-Ninurta to his Sukal-Rubi-U, or Grand Vizier, Ashur-iddin, advising him of the approach of his general Shulman-Mushafshu escorting the captive Kashtiliash, his wife and his retinue which incorporated a large number of women, on his way to exile after his defeat. In the process he defeated the Elamites, who had themselves coveted Babylon. He also wrote an epic poem documenting his victorious wars against Babylon and Elam. He progressed further south into what is today Saudi Arabia, conquering the pre-Arab kingdom of Dilmun which was a fellow Akkadian-speaking East Semitic kingdom, and Malaha a central Semitic-speaking state. After a Babylonian revolt, he raided and plundered the temples in Babylon, regarded as an act of sacrilege. As relations with the priesthood in Ashur began deteriorating, Tukulti-Ninurta built a new capital city, Kar-Tukulti-Ninurta. A series of short reigning kings followed, these being Ashur-Nadin-apli, 1207–1204 BC, Ashurnariri III, 1203–1198 BC, Enlil-Kujari Ujur, 1197–1193 BC, and Ninurta Apilakar, 1190–1190 BC. There were no significant expansions of the empire during their short tenures, and Babylonia seems to have freed itself from the Assyrian yoke for a time. Ashur-dan I, 1190–1144 BC, conquered huge swathes of Babylonia, subjugating its king, and taking much booty home to Assyria. However, this led to conflict with the powerful Elamites of southwest ancient Iran, who were themselves preying upon Babylonia. The Elamites took the Assyrian city of Arapha, modern Kirkuk, before being finally defeated and driven from the Assyrian Empire. Civil unrest ensued in Assyria after Ashur-dan I's death, and Ninurta Tukulti-Ashur and Mutakil-Nuska followed in quick succession during 1133 BC. Ashur-resh-ishi I, 1133–1116 BC, restored the tradition of powerful conquering kings. He campaigned to the east, taking the Zagros region of ancient Iran, and subjugated the Amorites, Alamu, and the newly appeared Arameans in the Levant. He also defeated the ambitious Nebuchadnezzar I of Babylonia, annexing Babylonian territory in the process. Tiglath-Pileser I, 1115–1074 BC, proved to be a long-reigning and all-conquering ruler, who firmly underlined Assyria's position as the world's leading military power. His first campaign in 1112 BC was against the Phrygians and Kaskians, who had attempted to occupy certain Assyrian-ruled Hittite districts in the upper Euphrates. Then he overran Commagene, Cilicia, and eastern Cappadocia, and drove the Hittites from the Assyrian province of Subartu, northeast of Malachia. In a subsequent campaign, the Assyrian forces penetrated into the mountains south of Lake Van and then turned westward to receive the submission of Malachia and Euryto. In his fifth year, Tiglath-Pileser attacked Cilicia and Comata in Cappadocia, and placed a record of his victories engraved on copper plates in a fortress he built to secure his Selykian conquests. The Aramaeans of northwestern and central Syria were the next targets of the Assyrian king, who made his way as far as the sources of the Tigris. The control of the high road to the Mediterranean was secured by the possession of the Hittite town of Patru at the junction between the Euphrates and Sejur. From there, he proceeded to conquer the Canaanite/Phoenician city-states of Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Samira, Berytus, Beirut, Aradus, and finally Arvad. There he embarked on a ship to sail the Mediterranean, on which he killed an ahiru or seahorse, which A. Leo Oppenheim translates as a narwhal, in the sea. He was passionately fond of hunting and was also a great builder. The general view is that the restoration of the temple of the gods Ashur and Hadad at the Assyrian capital of Assur, Ashur, was one of his initiatives. He was succeeded by Ashur-Apilakar, who reigned for only a short time. Ashur-bel-Kala, 1073–1056 BC, kept the vast empire together, campaigning successfully against Euryto and Phrygia to the north and the Arameans to the west. He maintained friendly relations with Marduk-Shapok-Zeri of Babylon. However, upon the death of that king, he invaded Babylonia and deposed the new ruler Kadamanberia, appointing Adad-apla-iddina as his vassal in Babylon. He built some of the earliest examples of both zoological gardens and botanical gardens in Ashur, collecting all manner of animals and plants from his empire, and receiving a collection of exotic animals as gifts from Egypt. Late in his reign, the Middle Assyrian Empire erupted into civil war, due to a rebellion by Tukulti-Mer, a pretender to the throne of Assyria. Ashur-bel-Kala eventually defeated Tukulti-Mer. However, the civil war in Assyria had allowed hordes of Arameans and Neo-Hittites to invade Assyrian-controlled territory from the west. Ashur-bel-Kala counterattacked them, and conquered as far as Carchemish and the source of the Khabur River. But by the end of his reign, Syria and Phoenicia, Canaan to the west, as far as the Mediterranean, previously under firm Assyrian control, were lost. The Middle Assyrian kingdom was well organized, and in the firm control of the king, who also functioned as the high priest of Ashur, the state god. He had certain obligations to fulfill in the cult, and had to provide resources for the temples. The priesthood became a major power in Assyrian society. Conflicts with the priesthood are thought to have been behind the murder of King Tukulti-Ninurta I. The Middle Assyrian period was marked by the long wars fought that helped build Assyria into a warrior society. The king depended on both the citizen class and priests in his capital, and the landed nobility who supplied the horses needed by Assyria's military. Documents and letters illustrate the importance of the latter to Assyrian society. Assyria needed less artificial irrigation than Babylonia, and horse breeding was extensive. Portions of elaborate texts about the care and training of them have been found. Trade was carried out in all directions. The mountain country to the north and west of Assyria was a major source of metal ore, as well as lumber. Economic factors were a common casus belli. All free male citizens were obliged to serve in the army for a time, a system which was called the Ilko service. A legal code was produced during the 14th and 13th centuries which, among other things, clearly shows that the social position of women in Assyria was lower than that of neighboring societies. Men were permitted to divorce their wives with no compensation paid to the latter. If a woman committed adultery, she could be beaten or put to death. It is not certain if these laws were seriously enforced, but they appear to be a backlash against some older documents that granted things like equal compensation to both partners in divorce. In the Middle Assyrian laws, sex crimes were punished identically whether they were homosexual or heterosexual. An individual faced no punishment for penetrating a cult prostitute, someone of an equal or lower social class, such as slaves, or someone whose gender roles were not considered solidly masculine. Such sexual relations were even seen as good fortune. However, homosexual relationships with royal attendants, between soldiers, or with those where a social better was submissive or penetrated were either treated as rape or seen as bad omens, and punishments applied. Furthermore, the article homosexualitat in Real Lexicon der Assyriology states, homosexuality in itself is thus nowhere condemned as licentiousness, as immorality, as social disorder, or as transgressing any human or divine law. Anyone could practice it freely, just as anyone could visit a prostitute, provided it was done without violence and without compulsion, and preferably as far as taking the passive role was concerned, with specialists. That there was nothing religiously amiss with homosexual love between men is seen by the fact that they prayed for divine blessing on it. The Bronze Age collapse from 1200 to 900 BC was a dark age for the entire Near East, North Africa, Asia Minor, Caucasus, Mediterranean and Balkan regions, with great upheavals and mass movements of people. Assyria and its empire were not unduly affected by these tumultuous events for some 150 years, perhaps the only ancient power that was not, and in fact thrived for most of the period. However, upon the death of Ashur-bel-Kala in 1056 BC, Assyria went into a comparative decline for the next 100 or so years. The empire shrank significantly, and by 1020 BC, Assyria appears to have controlled only areas close to Assyria itself, essential to keeping trade routes open in eastern Aramea, southeastern Asia Minor, central Mesopotamia and northwestern Iran. New West Semitic-speaking peoples such as the Arameans and Sudians moved into areas to the west and south of Assyria, including overrunning much of Babylonia to the south. Indo-European-speaking Iranic peoples such as the Medes, Persians, Sarmatians, and Parthians moved into the lands to the east of Assyria, displacing the native Kassites and Gutians and pressuring Elam and Mania, all of which ancient non-Indo-European civilizations of ancient Iran, and to the north in Asia Minor the Phrygians. Overran that part of the Hittites not already destroyed by Assyria, and Lydia emerged, a new Hurrian state named Euryto arose in the Caucasus, and Cimmerians, Colchians, Georgians, and Scythians around the Black Sea and Caucasus. Egypt was divided and in disarray, and Israelites were battling with other West Asian peoples such as the Amalekites, Moabites, Edomites, and Ammonites and the non-Semitic-speaking Pelasset/Philistines, who have been conjectured to be one of the so-called Sea peoples, for the control of southern Canaan. Dorian Greeks usurped the earlier Mycenaean Greeks in western Asia Minor, and the Sea peoples ravaged the eastern Mediterranean. Other new peoples, such as the Chaldeans, Sarmatians, Arabs, Nubians, and Cushites were to emerge later, during the Neo-Assyrian Empire, 911–605 BC. Despite the apparent weakness of Assyria in comparison to its former might, at heart it in fact remained a solid, well-defended nation whose warriors were the best in the world. Assyria, with its stable monarchy, powerful army, and secure borders, was in a stronger position during this time than potential rivals such as Egypt, Babylonia, Elam, Phrygia, Euryto, Persia, Lydia and Media. Kings such as Arib-Adad II, Ashur-Rubi II, Ashur-Nazir-Pal I, Tiglath-Pileser II and Ashur-Dan II successfully defended Assyria's borders and upheld stability during this tumultuous time. Assyrian kings during this period appear to have adopted a policy of maintaining and defending a compact, secure nation and satellite colonies immediately surrounding it, and interspersed this with sporadic punitive raids and invasions of neighboring territories when the need arose, including campaigning as far as the Mediterranean and sacking Babylonia. The Neo-Assyrian Empire is usually considered to have begun with the ascension of Adad-Nirari II in 911 BC, lasting until the fall of Nineveh at the hands of the Medes/Persians and Babylonians, Chaldeans in 609 BC. Assyria maintained a large and thriving rural population, combined with a number of well-fortified cities. Major Assyrian cities during this period included Nineveh, Assur, Kalhu, Kala, Nimrud, Arbela, Erbil, Arapha, Karka, Kirkuk, Dur-Sharaqin, Imgurin-Lil, Karchemish, Haran, Tushhan, Tilbarsip, Ikal-Ladim, Kanesh, Kartukulti-Ninarda, Urhai, Edessa, Guzana, Kahat, Amid, Diyarbakir, Merida, Mardin, Tabitu, Nuhadra, Dohuk, Iva, Safarvaim, Rachi, Purus-Handa, Sabata, Birdha, Tikrit, Tel Shem-Shera, Dur-Katlimu, and Shekna. Assyria is often noted for its brutality and cruelty during this period, although Assyrian harshness was reserved solely for those who took up arms against the Assyrian king, and none of the Assyrian kings of the Neo-Assyrian Empire or preceding Middle Assyrian Empire conducted genocides, massacres, or ethnic cleansings against civilian populations, non-combatant men, or women and children. However, the monument of Ashur-Nazir-Pal II describing his conquest of one city states, "Of some, I cut off their feet and hands, of others I cut off their ears, noses and lips, of the young men's ears I made a heap, of the old men's heads I made a minaret. The male children and female children I burned in the flames of the city." These claims, though, are seen by prominent Assyriologists such as Sags as propaganda pieces, designed to strike fear into enemies and act as a deterrent against rebellion, as opposed to being true accounts. Assyria once more began to expand with the rise of Adad-Nirari II in 911 BC. He cleared Aramean and other tribal peoples from Assyria's borders and began to expand in all directions into Anatolia, ancient Iran, Levant, and Babylonia. Ashur-Nazir-Pal II, 883–859 BC, continued this expansion apace, subjugating much of the Levant to the west, the newly arrived Persians and Medes to the east, annexed central Mesopotamia from Babylon to the south, and expanded deep into Asia Minor to the north. He moved the capital from Ashur to Kalhu, Kala/Nimrud, and undertook impressive building works throughout Assyria. Shalmaneser III, 859–824 BC, projected Assyrian power even further, conquering to the foothills of the Caucasus, Israel, and Aram Damascus, and subjugating Persia and the Arabs who dwelt to the south of Mesopotamia, as well as driving the Egyptians from Canaan. It was during the reign of Shalmaneser III that the Arabs and Chaldeans first entered the pages of recorded history. Little further expansion took place under Shamshi-Adad V and his successor, the regent Queen Semiramis. However, when Adad-Nirari III, 811–783 BC, came of age, he took the reins of power from mother and set about a relentless campaign of conquest, subjugated the Arameans, Phoenicians, Philistines, Israelites, Neo-Hittites, and Edomites, Persians, Medes and Manneans, penetrating as far as the Caspian Sea. He invaded and subjugated Babylonia, and then the migrant Chaldean and Sutean tribes settled in southeastern Mesopotamia whom he conquered and reduced to vassalage. After the reign of Adad-Nirari III, Assyria entered a period of instability and decline, losing its hold over most of its vassal and tributary territories by the middle of the 8th century BC, until the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, 745–727 BC. He created the world's first professional army, introduced Imperial Aramaic as the lingua franca of Assyria and its vast empire, and reorganized the empire drastically. Tiglath-Pileser III conquered as far as the East Mediterranean, bringing the Greeks of Cyprus, Phoenicia, Judah, Philistia, Samaria, and the whole of Aramea under Assyrian control. Not satisfied with merely holding Babylonia in vassalage, Tiglath-Pileser deposed its king and had himself crowned king of Babylon. The imperial, economic, political, military and administrative reforms of Tiglath-Pileser III were to prove a blueprint for future empires, such as those of the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Carthaginians, Byzantines, Arabs and Turks. Shalmaneser V reigned only briefly, but once more drove the Egyptians from southern Canaan, where they were fomenting revolt against Assyria. Sargon II quickly took Samaria, effectively ending the northern kingdom of Israel and carrying 27,000 people away into captivity into the Israelite diaspora. He was forced to fight a war to drive out the Scythians and Cimmerians who had attempted to invade Assyria's vassal states of Persia and Media. The Neo-Hittite states of northern Syria were conquered, as well as Cilicia, Lydia and Commagene. King Midas of Phrygia, fearful of Assyrian power, offered his hand in friendship. Elam was defeated and Babylonia and Chaldea reconquered. He made a new capital city named Dur-Sharrukin. He was succeeded by his son Sennacherib, who moved the capital to Nineveh and made the deported peoples work on improving Nineveh's system of irrigation canals. Nineveh was transformed into the largest city in the world at the time. Esarhaddon had Babylon rebuilt. He imposed a vassal treaty upon his Persian, Median and Parthian subjects, and he once more defeated the Scythes and Cimmerians. Tiring of Egyptian interference in the Assyrian Empire, Esarhaddon decided to conquer Egypt. In 671 BC he crossed the Sinai Desert and invaded divided Egypt at speed. He drove its foreign Nubian/Kushite rulers out, destroying the Kushite Empire in the process. Esarhaddon declared himself king of Egypt, Libya, and Kush. Esarhaddon stationed a small army in northern Egypt and describes how, all Ethiopians, Red Nubians/Kushites, I deported from Egypt, leaving not one left to do homage to me. He installed native Egyptian princes throughout the land to rule on his behalf. Under Ashurbanipal, 669–627 BC, an unusually well-educated king for his time who could speak, read, and write in Sumerian, Akkadian and Aramaic, Assyrian domination spanned from the Caucasus Mountains, modern Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, in the north to Nubia and Arabia in the south, and from the East Mediterranean, Libya, Egypt, Cyprus, and Antioch in the west to Persia, Siscia and the Caspian Sea in the east. Ultimately, Assyria conquered Babylonia, Chaldea, Elam, Media, Persia, Euryto, Armenia, Phoenicia, Aramea/Syria, Phrygia, the Neo-Hittite states, the Hurrian lands, Arabia, Gutium, Israel, Judah, Samara, Moab, Edom, Corduan, Cilicia, Mania, and Cyprus, and defeated and/or exacted tribute from Scythia, Samaria, Lydia, Nubia, Ethiopia, and others. At its height, the empire encompassed the whole of the modern nations of Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Cyprus, together with large swathes of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Sudan, Libya, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. The Assyrian Empire was severely crippled following the death of Ashurbanipal in 627 BC, the nation and its empire descending into a prolonged and brutal series of civil wars involving three rival kings, Ashur-etil-ilani, Sin-Shumulashir and Sin-Sharishkan. Egypt's 26th dynasty, which had been installed by the Assyrians as vassals, quietly detached itself from Assyria, although it was careful to retain friendly relations. Assyria's Babylonian relations rebelled circa 625 BC, under the leadership of Nabopolassar, who was believed to be from the migrant Choctaw people settled in the far southeast of Mesopotamia. By 620 BC Nabopolassar was in possession of much of Babylonia, bar some pro-Assyrian cities such as Nippur. Attempts to invade Assyria itself met with failure, and an Assyrian counterattack saw bitter fighting ensue in Babylonia. The Scythians and Cimmerians took advantage of the bitter fighting among the Assyrians to raid Assyrian colonies, with hordes of horse-borne marauders ravaging parts of Asia Minor and the Caucasus, where the vassal kings of Euryto and Lydia begged their Assyrian overlord for help in vain. They also raided the Levant, Israel, and Judah, where Ashkelon was sacked by the Scythians, and all the way into Egypt, whose coasts were ravaged and looted with impunity. The Iranic peoples under the Medes, aided by the previous Assyrian destruction of the hitherto dominant Elamites of ancient Iran, also took advantage of the upheavals in Assyria to coalesce into a powerful Median-dominated force which destroyed the pre-Iranic kingdom of Mania and absorbed the remnants of the pre-Iranic Elamites of southern Iran, and the equally pre-Iranic Gushans, Manines, and Kassites of the Zagros Mountains and the Caspian Sea. Cyaxares, technically a vassal of Assyria, in an alliance with the Scythians and Cimmerians, launched a surprise attack on a civil war beleaguered Assyria in 615 BC, sacking Kalhu, the biblical Kala/Nimrud, and taking Arapha, modern Kirkuk, and Gazur. Nabopolassar, still pinned down in southern Mesopotamia by Assyrian forces, was completely uninvolved in this major breakthrough against Assyria. Despite the sorely depleted state of Assyria, bitter fighting ensued. Throughout 614 BC the Medes continued to gradually make hard-fought inroads into Assyria itself, scoring a decisive and devastating victory over the Assyrian forces at the Battle of Assur. In 613 BC, however, the Assyrians scored a number of counter-attacking victories over the Medes Persians, Babylonians Chaldeans, and Scythians Cimmerians. This led to the unification of the forces ranged against Assyria, who launched a massive combined attack, finally besieging and entering Nineveh in late 612 BC, with Sin-Sharishkan being slain in the bitter street-by-street fighting. Despite the loss of almost all of its major cities, and in the face of overwhelming odds, Assyrian resistance continued under Ashur-uballit II, 612–609 BC, who fought his way out of Nineveh and coalesced Assyrian forces around Haran, which finally fell in 609 BC. The same year, Ashur-uballit II besieged Haran with the help of the Egyptian army, but this failed too, and this last defeat ended the Assyrian Empire. During the aftermath, Egypt, along with remnants of the Assyrian army, suffered a defeat at the Battle of Carchemish, in 605 BC, after which Assyria seems to have ceased to be an independent entity, although imperial records in the Assyrian style continued in Dur-Katlimmu until 599 BC, perhaps indicating some resistance endured for a few years. Assyria was to launch major rebellions against the Achaemenid Empire in 546 BC and 520 BC, and remained a geopolitical region, ethnic entity, and colonized province under various empires until the 7th century AD. Assyria was initially ruled by the short-lived Median Empire, 609–549 BC, after its fall. In a twist of fate, Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon, together with his son and co-regent Belshazzar, was himself an Assyrian from Haran. He had overthrown the short-lived Chaldean dynasty in Babylonia, after which the Chaldeans disappeared from history, being fully absorbed into the native population of Babylonia. However, apart from plans to dedicate religious temples in the city of Haran, Nabonidus showed little interest in rebuilding Assyria. Nineveh and Kalhu remained in ruins with only small numbers of Assyrians living within them. Conversely, a number of towns and cities, such as Arabqa, Guzana, Nohadra, and Haran, remained intact, and Assur and Arbela, Irbel, were not completely destroyed, as is attested by their later revival. However, Assyria spent much of this short period in a degree of devastation, following its fall. After the Medes were overthrown by the Persians as the dominant force in ancient Iran, Assyria was ruled by the Persian Achaemenid Empire, as Athura, from 549 to 330 BC, see Achaemenid Assyria. Between 546 and 545 BC, Assyria rebelled against the new Persian dynasty, which had usurped the previous Median dynasty. The rebellion centered around Tyre was eventually quashed by Cyrus the Great. Assyria seems to have recovered dramatically, and flourished during this period. It became a major agricultural and administrative center of the Achaemenid Empire, and its soldiers were a mainstay of the Persian army. In fact, Assyria even became powerful enough to raise another full-scale revolt against the Persian Empire in 525–19 BC. The Persians had spent centuries under Assyrian domination, their first ruler Achaemenes and his successors, having been vassals of Assyria, and Assyrian influence can be seen in Achaemenid art, infrastructure, and administration. Early Persian rulers saw themselves as successors to Ashurbanipal, and Mesopotamian Aramaic was retained as the lingua franca of the empire for over 200 years, and Greek writers such as Thucydides still referred to it as the Assyrian language. Nineveh was never rebuilt, however, and 200 years after it was sacked, Xenophon reported only small numbers of Assyrians living amongst its ruins. Conversely, the ancient city of Assur once more became a rich and prosperous entity. It was in 5th century BC Assyria that the Syriac language and Syriac script evolved. 5 centuries later, these were later to have a global influence as the liturgical language and written script for Syriac Christianity and its accompanying Syriac literature, which also emerged in Assyria before spreading throughout the Near East, Asia Minor, the Caucasus, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and China. In 332 BC, Assyria fell to Alexander the Great, the Macedonian emperor, who called the inhabitants Assyrioi. The Macedonian Empire, 332–312, was partitioned in 312 BC. It thereafter became part of the Seleucid Empire, 312 BC. It is from this period that the later Syria vs Assyria naming controversy arises. The Seleucids applied the name Syria, which is a 9th century BC Indo-Anatolian derivation of Assyria, see etymology of Syria, not only to Assyria itself, but also to the Levantine lands to the west, historically known as Aram and Ebernari, which had been part of the Assyrian Empire but, the northeast corner aside, never a part of Assyria proper. When the Seleucids lost control of Assyria proper, the name Syria survived but was erroneously applied not only to the land of Assyria itself, but also now to Aramea. This was to lead to both the Assyrians from Mesopotamia and the Arameans and Phoenicians from the Levant being collectively dubbed Syrians, and later also Syriacs, in Greco-Roman and later European culture, regardless of ethnicity, history, or geography. During Seleucid rule, Assyrians ceased to hold the senior military, economic and civil positions they had enjoyed under the Achaemenids, being largely replaced by Greeks. The Greek language also replaced Mesopotamian East Aramaic as the lingua franca of the empire, although this did not affect the Assyrian population themselves, who were not Hellenist during the Seleucid era, retaining their own language, religion, and culture. During the Seleucid period in southern Mesopotamia, Babylon was gradually abandoned in favor of a new city named Seleucia on the Tigris, effectively bringing an end to Babylonia as a geopolitical entity. By 150 BC, Assyria was largely under the control of the Parthian Empire. The Parthians seem to have exercised only loose control over Assyria, and between the mid-2nd century BC and 4th century AD a number of Neo-Assyrian states arose. These included the ancient capital of Assur itself, Adiabene with its capital of Arbela, modern Erbil, Beth Nuhadra with its capital of Nohadra, modern Dohuk, Osran, with its capitals of Edessa and Amid, modern Sanli Urfa and Diyarbakir, Hatra, and Beth Garme, with its capital at Arafah, modern Kirkuk. Assyrian Adiabenian rulers converted to Judaism from ancient Mesopotamian religion in the 1st century. After 115 AD, there are no historic traces of Jewish royalty in Adiabene, and the populace remained followers of Mesopotamian religion or Christianity. These freedoms were accompanied by a major Assyrian cultural revival, and temples to the Assyrian national gods Ashur, Sin, Hadad, Ishtar, Ninurta, Tammuz, and Shamash were once more dedicated throughout Assyria and Upper Mesopotamia during this period. In addition, Christianity arrived in Assyria soon after the death of Christ, and the Assyrians began to gradually convert to Christianity from the ancient Mesopotamian religion during the period between the early 1st and 3rd centuries. Assyria became an important center of Syriac Christianity and Syriac literature, with the Church of the East, including its offshoots the Assyrian Church of the East and Chaldean Catholic Church, evolving in Assyria, and the Syriac Orthodox Church partly also, with Osran becoming the first independent Christian state in history. However, in 116, under Trajan, Assyria and its independent states were briefly taken over by Rome as the province of Assyria. The Assyrian kingdom of Adiabene was destroyed as an independent state during this period. Roman rule lasted only a few years, and the Parthians once more regained control with the help of the Assyrians, who were incited to overthrow the Roman garrisons by the Parthian king. However, a number of Assyrians were conscripted into the Roman army, with many serving in the region of Hadrian's Wall in Roman Britain, and inscriptions in Aramaic made by soldiers have been discovered in northern England dating from the 2nd century AD. With loose Parthian rule restored, Assyria and its patchwork of states continued much as they had before the Roman interregnum, although Assyria and Mesopotamia as a whole became a front line between the Roman and Parthian empires. Other new religious movements also emerged in the form of Gnostic sects such as Mandaeanism, as well as the now extinct Manichaean religion. In 226, Assyria was largely taken over by the Sasanian Empire. After driving out the Romans and Parthians, the Sassanid rulers set about annexing the independent states within Assyria during the mid to late 3rd century AD, the last being Assur itself in the late 250s to early 260s. Christianity continued to spread, and many of the ethnically Assyrian churches that exist today are among the oldest in the world. For example, the Syriac Orthodox Church is purported to have been founded by Saint Peter himself in 67 AD. Nevertheless, although predominantly Christian, a minority of Assyrians still held on to their ancient Mesopotamian religion until as late as the 10th or 11th century AD. The Assyrians lived in a province known as Assuristan, and the region was on the frontier of the Byzantine and Sasanian empires. The land was known as Azaristan, the Sassanid Persian name meaning land of the Assyrians, during this period, and became the birthplace of the distinct Church of the East, now split into the Assyrian Church of the East, Ancient Church of the East and Chaldean Catholic Church, and a center of the Syriac Orthodox Church, with a flourishing Syriac, Assyrian, Christian culture which exists there to this day. Temples were still being dedicated to the national god Ashur, as well as other Mesopotamian gods, in his home city in Haran and elsewhere during the 4th and 5th centuries AD, indicating the ancient pre-Christian Assyrian identity was still extant to some degree. During the Sasanian period, much of what had once been Babylonia in southern Mesopotamia was incorporated into Assyria, and in effect the whole of Mesopotamia came to be known as Azaristan. Parts of Assyria appear to have been semi-independent as late as the latter part of the 4th century AD, with a king named Sennacherib II reputedly ruling the northern reaches in 370s AD. Centuries of constant warfare between the Byzantine Empire and Sassanid Empire left both empires exhausted, which made both of them open to loss in a war against the Muslim Arab army, under the newfound Rashidun Caliphate. After the early Islamic conquests, Assyria was dissolved as an official administrative entity by an empire. Under Arab rule, Mesopotamia as a whole underwent a gradual process of further Arabization and the beginning of Islamification, and the region saw a large influx of non-indigenous Arabs, and from the 11th and 12th centuries through to the early 20th century AD, a gradual influx of Kurds, Iranian, and Turkic peoples. However, the indigenous Assyrian population of northern Mesopotamia retained their language, religion, culture, and identity. Under the Arab Islamic empires, the Christian Assyrians were classed as dhimmis, who had certain restrictions imposed upon them. Assyrians were thus excluded from specific duties and occupations reserved for Muslims. They did not enjoy the same political rights as Muslims, their word was not equal to that of a Muslim in legal and civil matters without a Muslim witness, they were subject to payment of a special tax, jizya, and they were banned from spreading their religion further in Muslim-ruled lands. However, personal matters such as marriage and divorce were governed by the cultural laws of the Assyrians. For those reasons, and even during the Sasanian period before Islamic rule, the Assyrian Church of the East formed a church structure that spread Nestorian Christianity to as far away as China, in order to proselytize away from hitherto Christian or Christian-friendly but now Muslim-ruled regions in Iran, the Levant, Anatolia, Arabian Peninsula, and their homeland in Mesopotamia, with evidence of their massive church structure being the Nestorian stele, an artifact found in China which documented over 100 years of Christian history in China from 600 to 781 AD. Assyrian Christians maintained relations with fellow Christians in Armenia and Georgia throughout the Middle Ages. In the 12th century AD, Assyrian priests interceded on behalf of persecuted Arab Muslims in Georgia. The first signs of trouble for the Assyrians started in the 13th century, when the Mongols first invaded the Near East after the fall of Baghdad in 1258 to Hulagu Khan. Assyrians at first did very well under Mongol rule, as the shamanist Mongols were sympathetic to them, with Assyrian priests having traveled to Mongolia centuries before. The Mongols in fact spent most of their time oppressing Muslims and Jews, outlawing the practice of circumcision and halal butchery, as they found them repulsive and violent. Therefore, as one of the only groups in the region looked at in a good light, Assyrians were given special privileges and powers, with Hulagu even appointing an Assyrian Christian governor to Erbil, Arbela, and allowing the Syriac Orthodox Church to build a church there. However, the Mongol rulers in the Near East eventually converted to Islam. Sustained persecutions of Christians throughout the entirety of the Ilkhanate began in earnest in 1295 under the rule of Wara Amir Nauruz, which affected the indigenous Christians greatly. During the reign of the Ilkhan al-Jitu, the inhabitants of Erbil seized control of the citadel and much of the city in rebellion against the Muslims. In spring 1310, the Mongol Malik, governor, of the region attempted to seize it from them with the help of the Kurds and Arabs, but was defeated. After his defeat he decided to siege the city. The Assyrians held out for 3 months, but the citadel was at last taken by Ilkhanate troops and Arab, Turkic, and Kurdish tribesmen on July 1, 1310. The defenders of the citadel fought to the last man, and many of the inhabitants of the lower town were subsequently massacred. Regardless of these hardships, the Assyrian people remained numerically dominant in the north of Mesopotamia as late as the 14th century AD, and the city of Assur functioned as their religious and cultural capital. The seat of the Catholicos of the Church of the East was Seleucia Ctesiphon, not Assur. In the mid-14th century the Muslim Turkish ruler Tamerlane conducted a religiously motivated massacre of the indigenous Christians, and entirely destroyed the vast Church of the East structure established throughout the Far East outside what had been the Sassanid Empire, with the exception of the St. Thomas Christians of the Malabar coast in India, who numbered 4.2 million in the 2011 census of Kerala. After Timur's campaign, ancient Assyria's cultural and religious capital of Assur fell entirely into ruins and part of it was used as a graveyard until the 1970s. Around 100 years after the massacres by Timur, a religious schism known as the Schism of 1552 occurred among the Assyrian Christians of northern Mesopotamia. A large number of followers of the Church of the East were dissatisfied with the leadership of the Assyrian Church, at this point based in the Rabban Hormizd monastery near Al-Qash in the Nineveh Plains, and in particular with the system of hereditary succession of the Patriarch. 3 bishops elected the abbot of the monastery, Shimon VIII Yohanan Soleka, as a rival patriarch. These did not have the rank of metropolitan bishop, which was required for appointing a patriarch and which was granted only to members of the patriarch's family. Soleka therefore, after being denied by the Syriac Orthodox Church, went to Rome to be made a patriarch, entered into communion with the Catholic Church and was appointed Patriarch of Mosul, and Athura later altered to Patriarch of the Chaldean Church of Mosul by Pope Julius III in 1553. He won support only in the northern Assyrian city of Diyarbakir, known traditionally as Amid by the Assyrians, where he set up his residence, and in Mardin, Merida to the Assyrians. In 1555, he was killed by the Turkish Ottoman authorities after being denounced by the traditionalist patriarch, but the metropolitans he had ordained elected a successor for him, initiating the Shimon line of patriarchs, all of whom took the name Shimon, Simon. The patriarchs of this line requested and obtained confirmation from Rome only until 1583, when Rome withdrew recognition. In 1672 they clearly broke off communion with Rome and returned to the Assyrian Church, but continued as a line of patriarchs independent from that at Al-Qash, with their seat, from then on, in the Assyrian town of Qadchanis in the Hakkari Mountains. In a letter of June 29, 1653, 19 years before the Shimon line broke off relations with Rome, Shimon XI Eshwio, 1638–1656, called himself Patriarch of the Chaldean Catholics. There is no record of a response from Rome confirming him as Catholic Patriarch. Biblical Aramaic was sometimes erroneously called Chaldee or Chaldee in Western sources, although this language was first introduced to Assyria by Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BC, and was so ingrained in Assyria that it came to be known as Assyrian to such Greek writers as Thucydides and Xenophon. Assyrian Christians, whose liturgical language was and is a form of Aramaic, continued to be referred to as Assyrians after the fall of their empire. See Assyrian Continuity, Hormizd Rassam, 1826–1910, applied the term Chaldeans to those Assyrians in communion with Rome and stated that the present Chaldeans, with a few exceptions, speak the same dialect used in the Targum, and in some parts of Ezra and Daniel, which are called Chaldee. Long before 1672, the Shimon line, as it gradually returned to the traditional worship of the Assyrian Church of the East, thereby losing the allegiance of the western regions, moved from Turkish-controlled Diyarbakir to Urmia in Persia, where there was a long-established Assyrian presence. The bishopric of Diyarbakir became subject to the Al-Qash Patriarch. Bishop Joseph of Diyarbakir converted to the Catholic faith in 1667 or 1668. In 1677, he obtained recognition from the Turkish authorities as invested with independent power in Diyarbakir and Mardin, and in 1681 he was recognized by Rome as Patriarch of the Chaldeans deprived of its Patriarch. Thus was instituted the Josephite line, a third line of patriarchs. In the Al-Qash line, Eliah 7, 1591–1617, Eliah 8, 1617–1660, and Eliah 9, 1660–1700, contacted Rome at various times but without establishing union. Union was achieved in 1771 under Eliah 11, who died in 1778. His successor Eliah 12, after sending his profession of faith to Rome and receiving confirmation as Catholic Patriarch, adopted a traditionalist position in 1779. His opponents elected Yohanan Hormizd, a young nephew of Eliah 11, whom Eliah 11 had intended to be his successor. Although Yohanan Hormizd won the support of most of the followers of the Al-Qash Patriarchate, Rome considered his election to be irregular and, instead of accepting him as Patriarch, merely confirmed him as Metropolitan of Mosul and Patriarchal Administrator. He was thus granted the powers and the insignia of a Patriarch, but not the title. It made the same arrangement in Diyarbakir, appointing as Patriarchal Administrator Augustine Hindi, a nephew of Joseph IV, whom his uncle wished to be his successor as Patriarch. There were thus two traditionalist patriarchates, the Eliah line and the Shimon, and, under administrators, two Catholic patriarchates, Diyarbakir and Al-Qash/Mosul. In 1804, Eliah 11 died and had no traditionalist successor. Augustine Hindi died in 1827 and, in 1830, Rome appointed Yohanan Hormizd as Patriarch of all the Catholics. The Shimon line, which had been the first to enter union with Rome, remained at the head of the original traditionalist Assyrian Church of the East, and that continued to be in the hands of the same family until the death in 1975 of Shimon XXIE Shai. At the same time, the Al-Qash line continues, without hereditary succession, at the head of the Chaldean Catholic Church. The term Chaldean is properly taken as a denominational term, like Nestorian, rather than an ethnic one. The Chaldean Catholic Church emerged in northern Mesopotamia from the Assyrian Church of northern Mesopotamia and southeastern Anatolia, and its followers hailed from the Assyrian homeland in the far north of Mesopotamia, rather than the historic Chaldea which existed between the 9th and 6th centuries BC in the far southeast of Mesopotamia before disappearing. Chaldean Catholics speak the same dialects, hail from the same towns and villages, have the same family names and have the same genetic profiles as those traditionally and historically known as Assyrians. Christian women were burned by Kurdish women, to recover the gold and precious stones they were supposed to have swallowed during the Assyrian genocide. After these splits, the Assyrians suffered a number of religiously and ethnically motivated massacres throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, such as the massacres of Badr Khan, which resulted in the massacre of over 10,000 Assyrians in the 1840s, culminating in the large-scale Hamidian massacres of unarmed men, women, and children by Turks and Kurds in the 1890s at the hands of the Ottoman Empire and its associated, largely Kurdish and Arab, militias, which greatly reduced their numbers. Particularly in southeastern Turkey, where over 25,000 Assyrians were murdered. The Adana massacre of 1909, largely aimed at Armenian Christians, also accounted for the murder of some 1,500 Assyrians. The Assyrians suffered a further catastrophic series of events during World War I in the form of the religiously and ethnically motivated Assyrian genocide at the hands of the Ottomans and their Kurdish and Arab allies from 1915 to 1918. Some sources claim that the highest number of Assyrians killed during the period was 750,000, while a 1922 Assyrian assessment set it at 275,000. The Assyrian genocide ran largely in conjunction with the similarly ethno-religiously motivated Armenian genocide, Greek genocide, and Great Famine of Mount Lebanon. In reaction against Ottoman cruelty, the Assyrians took up arms, and an Assyrian independence movement began during the turbulent events of World War I. For a time, the Assyrians fought successfully against overwhelming numbers, scoring a number of victories against the Ottomans and Kurds, and also hostile Arab and Iranian groups. However, due to the collapse of the Russian Empire due to the Russian Revolution and the similar collapse of the Armenian defense, the Assyrians were left without allies. As a result, the Assyrians were vastly outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded, cut off, and without supplies. The only option they had was to flee the region into northwest Iran and fight their way, with around 50,000 civilians in tow, to British train lines going to Mandatory Iraq. The sizable Assyrian presence in southeastern Anatolia, which had endured for over 4 millennia, was thus reduced to no more than 15,000 by the end of World War I, and by 1924 many of those who remained were forcibly expelled in a display of ethnic cleansing by the Turkish government, with many leaving and later founding villages in the Supna and Nala valleys in the Dohuk Governorate of Iraq. In 1920 the Assyrian settlements in Minden and Baquba were attacked by Iraqi Arabs, but the Assyrian tribesmen displayed their military prowess by successfully defeating and driving off the Arab forces. The Assyrians also sided with the British during the Iraqi revolt against the British. The Assyrian levies were founded by the British in 1922, with ancient Assyrian military rankings, such as Rab Shakeh, Rab Talia, and Turtanu, being revived for the first time in millennia for this force. The Assyrians were prized by the British rulers for their fighting qualities, loyalty, bravery, and discipline, and were used to help the British put down insurrections among the Arabs, Kurds, and Turkoman, guard the borders with Iran and Turkey, and protect British military installations. During the 1920s, Assyrian levies saw action in effectively defeating Arab and Kurdish forces during anti-British rebellions in Iraq. After Iraq was granted independence by the British in 1933, the Assyrians suffered the Simele massacre, where thousands of unarmed villagers, men, women, and children, were slaughtered by joint Arab-Kurdish forces of the Iraqi army. The massacres of civilians followed a clash between armed Assyrian tribesmen and the Iraqi army, where the Iraqi forces suffered a defeat after trying to disarm the Assyrians, whom they feared would attempt to secede from Iraq. Armed Assyrian levies were prevented by the British from going to the aid of these civilians, and the British government then whitewashed the massacres at the League of Nations. Despite these betrayals, the Assyrians were allied with the British during World War II, with 11 Assyrian companies seeing action in Palestine/Israel and another 4 serving in Greece, Cyprus, and Albania. Assyrians played a major role in the victory over Arab Iraqi forces at the Battle of Habaniyah and elsewhere in 1941, when the Iraqi government decided to join World War II on the side of Nazi Germany. The British presence in Iraq lasted until 1955, and Assyrian levies remained attached to British forces until this time, after which they were disarmed and disbanded. A further persecution of Assyrians took place in the Soviet Union in the late 1940s and early 1950s when thousands of Assyrians settled in Georgia, Armenia, and southern Russia were forcibly deported from their homes in the dead of night by Stalin without warning or reason to Central Asia, with most being relocated to Kazakhstan, where a small minority still remain. The period from the 1940s through to 1963 was a period of respite for the Assyrians in northern Iraq and northeast Syria. The regime of Iraqi President Qasim in particular saw the Assyrians accepted into mainstream society. Many urban Assyrians became successful businessmen, a number of Assyrians moved south to cities such as Baghdad, Basra, and Nasiriyah to enhance their economic prospects. Others were well represented in politics, the military, the arts and entertainment. Assyrian towns, villages, farmsteads, and Assyrian quarters in major cities flourished undisturbed, and Assyrians came to excel and be overrepresented in sports such as boxing, football, athletics, wrestling and swimming. However, in 1963, the Ba'ath Party took power by force in Iraq, and came to power in Syria the same year. The Baathists, though secular, were Arab nationalists, and set about attempting to Arabaize the many non-Arab peoples of Iraq and Syria, including the Assyrians. This policy included refusing to acknowledge the Assyrians as an ethnic group, banning the publication of written material in Assyrian Eastern Aramaic, and banning its teaching in schools, together with an attempt to Arabaize the ancient pre-Arab heritage of Mesopotamian civilization. The policies of the Baathists had already long been mirrored in Turkey, whose nationalist governments have refused to acknowledge the Assyrians as an ethnic group since the 1920s, and have attempted to Turkify the Assyrians by calling them Semitic Turks and forcing them to adopt Turkish names and language, while repressing the Assyrian language. In Iran, Assyrians continued to enjoy cultural, religious, and ethnic rights for a time, but due to the 1979 Islamic Revolution their community has experienced continuous decline due to religious intolerance and persecution. In the aftermath of the Iraq War of 2003, Assyrians became the targets of Islamist terrorist attacks and intimidation from both Sunni and Shia Muslim groups, as well as criminal kidnapping organizations, with little or no protection offered by American and British forces stationed in the region, forcing many of those who had migrated to southern and central Iraq in the 1940s and 1950s to relocate back to safer Assyrian-populated regions in the north of the country or northeast Syria. In 2017, the KRG replaced the Al-Qash mayor, Faiz Abed Yaweri, with a KDP member, Lara Zara. An Assyrian protested in response. The Iraqi government ordered Lara Zara to vacate her post, and return the title of mayor to Yaweri. In recent years, Assyrians in northern Iraq and northeast Syria have become the target of attacks amounting to genocide by Islamist militants like ISIL and Nusra Front. In 2014, ISIL attacked unarmed Assyrian towns and villages in the Assyrian homelands of northern Iraq and northeast Syria, and Assyrians were forced from their homes in cities such as Mosul, had their houses and possessions stolen, both by ISIL and also by their own former Arab and Kurdish Muslim neighbors. Assyrian Bronze Age and Iron Age monuments and archaeological sites, as well as numerous Assyrian churches and monasteries, have been systematically vandalized and destroyed by ISIL. These include the ruins of Nineveh, Kalhu, Nimrud, Assur, Dur-Sharakan, Arafah and Hatra. ISIL destroyed a 3,000-year-old ziggurat. ISIL destroyed Virgin Mary Church, in 2015 St. Mark-Urkaz Church was destroyed and the cemetery was bulldozed. Assyrians in both northern Iraq and northeast Syria have responded by forming armed Assyrian militias to defend their territories, and despite being heavily outnumbered and outgunned have had notable success in driving ISIL from Assyrian towns and villages, and defending others from attack. Armed Assyrian militias have also fought ISIL alongside armed groups of Kurds, Turkoman, Yazidis, Shabaks, Armenian Christians, Khalya, Mandeans, Circassians, and Shia Muslim Arabs and Iranians. Toqin-Nasha, which translates to those who sacrifice, is a militia that was formed days after ISIL took over Mosul in 2014. The military force is made up of Assyrian volunteers, who come from all over the Nineveh plains. Toqin-Nasha is supported by Assyrian Patriotic Party and is led by Wilson Kamu. It is estimated that 50% of Iraqi Assyrians fled their ancient homelands since 2003. Assyrians who have fled have ended up all over the world, although some have returned and others plan to do so. 2009 U.S. Census Bureau survey reported that roughly 100,000 have relocated to the United States. Achaemenid Assyria, 539–330 BC, retained a separate identity, official correspondence being in Imperial Aramaic, and there was even a determined revolt of the two Assyrian provinces of Mada and Athura in 520 BC. Under Seleucid rule, however, Aramaic gave way to Greek as the official administrative language. Aramaic was marginalized as an official language, but remained spoken in both Assyria and Babylonia by the general populace. It also remained the spoken tongue of the indigenous Assyrian/Babylonian citizens of all Mesopotamia under Persian, Greek, and Roman rule, and indeed well into the Arab period it was still the language of the majority, particularly in the north of Mesopotamia, surviving to this day among the Assyrian Christians. Between 150 BC and 226 AD, Assyria changed hands between the Parthian Empire and the Romans until coming under the rule of the Sasanian Empire from 226 to 651, where it was known as Azaristan. A number of at least partly Neo-Assyrian kingdoms existed in the area between in the late Classical and early Christian period also, Adiabene, Hatra, and Osren. Classical historiographers and biblical writers had only retained a fragmented, very dim and often inaccurate picture of Assyria. It was remembered that there had been an Assyrian empire predating the Persian one, but all particulars were lost. Thus Jerome's Chronicon lists 36 kings of the Assyrians, beginning with Ninus, son of Belus, down to Sardanapalus, the last king of the Assyrians before the empire fell to Arbyshus the Median. Almost none of these have been substantiated as historical, with the exception of the Neo-Assyrian and Babylonian rulers listed in the Canon of Kings, beginning with Nabonassar. The Assyrians began to form and adopt a distinct Eastern Christianity, with its accompanying Syriac literature, between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. However, ancient Mesopotamian religion was still alive and well into the 4th century, and pockets survived into the 10th century and possibly as late as the 17th century in Mardin. However, the religion is now dead, and the Assyrian people, though still retaining Eastern Aramaic dialects as a mother tongue, are now wholly Christian. The modern discovery of Babylonia and Assyria begins with excavations in Nineveh in 1845, which revealed the library of Ashur-bani-pal. Decipherment of the cuneiform script was a formidable task that took more than a decade, but, by 1857, the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland was convinced that reliable reading of cuneiform texts was possible. Assyriology has since pieced together the formerly largely forgotten history of Mesopotamia. In the wake of the archaeological and philological rediscovery of ancient Assyria, Assyrian nationalism became increasingly popular among the surviving remnants of the Assyrian people, who have come to strongly identify with ancient Assyria.